Welcome to GRE. I'm your host, Keith Weinhold, with the state of today's inflation-stoked and supply-suppressed real estate market today, then free market principles versus government intervention. Who's winning the conflict and what you can learn from this today on Get Rich Education. Hey, my friend Damian Lupo informed me that checkbook IRAs have been made illegal by the U.S. tax court. If you have a checkbook IRA, your holdings are now disqualified with taxes and penalties up to 50%. But don't panic. Damian and the EQRP company can fix this. Those IRAs can be converted into EQRPs, retroactive to last year, getting those tax deductions and reducing your taxable income. This way you can invest your 401k or IRA in real estate, Bitcoin, gold, and even your own business. Whether you're a full-time investor, retired, or a dentist with dozens of employees, if you're listening, you qualify. The EQRP works. It's the solution, and it helps you control your money, kill UBIT, and help you pay way less taxes. To learn more about this strategy and free up your retirement money, get the 2022 EQRP Special Report. Send a text to 307-213-3475 with the word RICH. Text 307-213-3475 with the word RICH. The people that our listeners can't stop talking about are Ridge Lending Group, NMLS 42056. They've provided GRE listeners with more loans than anyone, and it's where I got my last few loans. They finance single-family income property up to 4plexes. They're the number one lender for beginners and veterans. Start your pre-qualification, chat with President Shaley Ridge personally, and get your custom plan for expanding your cash-flowing portfolio. Start at ridgelendinggroup.com.
You're listening to the show that has created more financial freedom than nearly any show in the world. This is Get Rich Education.
Welcome to GRE, from Liverpool, England to Liverpool, New York, and across 188 nations worldwide. I'm Keith Weinhold. This is Get Rich Education. I am really grateful to have you here, as usual, for the 388th consecutive week. I'm going to talk about today's real estate market, and then later our guest and I are going to discuss some timeless principles. And you might recognize today's guest's voice, Lawrence W. Reed from the FEE, F-E-E, the Foundation for Economic Education, from his explainer videos that are really well publicized out there. We're going to discuss really this conflict between free market principles and government intervention in the economy from before the Great Depression all the way up to some lessons for today. It looks to me like Russia's invasion of Ukraine will lead to probably more inflation and then hence higher interest rates over the long term. That is how I see it. But in the short term, where we're at potentially the height of the uncertainty, as you would expect, as what typically happens in uncertainty, people have fled to the safety of bonds. And when people buy bonds, that pushes up bond prices, which lowers bond yields. And those bond yields, those are what mortgage interest rates are closely tied to, those long-term, like 30-year fixed mortgage rates. Of course, specifically, we're talking about that bond yield being that yield on the 10-year Treasury note. However, I think you understand why longer term, greater shortages of products that America imports from Russia and imports from Ukraine, these shortages of things like petroleum products and coal and fertilizer and wheat and more, that all creates an environment in the U.S. where you have more of these dollars that have been created chasing then even fewer goods. Well, that, of course, is a recipe for more inflation and, in turn, a greater propensity that the Fed increases interest rates. I think that is the more likely scenario longer term. But we'll see. If the war drags on and it leads to a U.S. recession somehow, well, the Fed might have to reverse course and then go back and lower interest rates. The Fed concludes their next meeting just 2 days from now, and by then it is widely expected that we will see the first Fed rate increase since 2018. Yeah, it's been that long since rates have been hiked. Home prices have now spiked to an all-time high of, do you have any idea? Are you ready for this? This is at the end of just last month, per Redfin. It is now a median all-time high American home price of $364,000. That is a 16% increase from a year earlier. And despite all that, a home's affordability is not all that bad by measures like these still low mortgage interest rates and pretty responsible mortgage loan underwriting to go with them and higher wages. And you have record American equity positions from these move-up buyers. That makes it more affordable for them. And, builders now charging, let's say, $400K for a new construction starter home. Well, that builder has got to get compensated for risk if their unfinished home just sits there until it can get finished. And the builder has then that carrying cost of financing something that takes them longer to finish and sell. And why does it just sit there? Well, of course, it takes them longer to finish it and sell it when we have these supply shortages and inflation piles on and potential commodity-induced shortages from Russia's invasion of Ukraine when that piles on too. My goodness. Now, these more nascent trends, understand that they're really built on top of this foundation of other trends that you've had brewing in America for decades that increase the cost of a home. And these foundational things, they might be getting chipped away at, some of them, but these things are not going to go away anytime soon. Okay, what I'm talking about are things like, just look at the environmental movement. Now, understand, there's a part of me, even a big, substantial part of me, that would rather see ducks floating on a pond that's surrounded by turtles and frogs, rather than have those ponds filled in and then have affordable housing built on top of it. But balance that by understanding that what the environmental movement does is that it increases the value of the existing land and property all around it because it makes it more difficult for others to build on that other land that's being protected. And another longer-term contributor to higher housing costs is this increased safety that's been building up for decades. Sometimes you just have to at least ask the question, how far are we going to go with the safety? First, it was, for example, smoke detectors. And then it was adding carbon monoxide detectors all over the place inside of a home. I just got an email from my property manager saying that we need to get carbon monoxide detectors added to a property. You need to have one within 10 feet of every bedroom. Now, once something like that becomes law, you've got to do it. You, as an owner, you can't say no. Not only does this increase the cost of housing, but once those things are required all over the place, it also increases the cost of entry-level housing, that minimum threshold for getting in. Well, what happens when you increase the cost of entry-level housing, some of which make the best rentals? Well, then prices rise and rents rise. And another ill-gotten consequence is that this increases homelessness. Yeah, those people on the economic brink, they're the people that get pushed out of housing first. Homelessness is on the rise with building regulations due to NIMBYism, not in my backyardism. Homelessness is on the rise with building restrictions due to environmental policy. And homelessness has been on the rise with stringent safety standards and sometimes downright onerous safety standards. All of this stuff makes housing less affordable. So I guess my point is that more duck ponds equal more homelessness. You got that? Whichever of those two you prefer, just understand that there is a trade-off there. So let's talk about what can be done. Well, in short, it's more building. Tiny homes and ADUs, they are becoming a topic in more jurisdictions now. Yes, ADUs, accessory dwelling units, which are so popular in places like California. You might also know them as granny flats. And what they are is they are separate, smaller, detached structures, and they share the same lot as a larger primary home. In fact, before I even knew what the term ADU meant, I basically lived in one. It was a pool house when I paid rent and attended graduate school in Westchester, Pennsylvania. When building is stifled, and now you've got inflation and building supply shortages and a shortage of skilled labor in trades, it all sets us up for more increases in the housing price. As we're about to talk with our guest about the really conflict of free market principles versus government intervention in those free markets, we'll discuss both real estate and broader economics. I've discussed with you before, for example, how a government intervention like rent control, putting a cap on rents, how that often ravages the very people that it was intended to help, the tenants of those properties. Yeah, years of rigid rent control, well, that can make a landlord say to themselves, gosh, what incentive do I have to improve this property? What incentive do I even have to maintain this property after a while if I cannot charge any more in rent? And that's how neighborhoods can dilapidate and even become razed. And this is why those few rent control states that are concentrated on some parts of the U.S. coasts, that's why we avoid areas like that. Here's the discussion with our guest. This week's guest is the former president of the Foundation for Economic Education, FEE, F-E-E. It's been the longtime president there. Only the founder of that organization has been president longer. And he's also editor of some best-selling economics books and books on other topics like Great Myths of the Great Depression. Welcome to GRE, Larry Reed.
My pleasure. Thank you, Keith.
Free market principles, that's a phrase that's often thrown around. And why don't we talk about just what those are and just what the merits and the pros and cons of them are? Larry, I think proponents of free market principles say, in theory, this is good. It ensures competitive markets. Free markets incentivize innovation, and people have a right to choose what to produce and consume in a free market economy. But yet detractors of free market principles say something like, well, look, it creates this embarrassing concentration of wealth after a while. For example, you might have the top 1% that control half the wealth in a free market system after generations. Talk to us about that, including some of the critics, including those that say basically that the free market disadvantages the poor.
A very good question, Keith, because it's one that a lot of people raise. I hear it all the time. To me, free market principles include such things as property rights, the recognition that if you've created it or traded freely and voluntarily for it, it's yours. It doesn't belong to the government or someone else who thinks they know better what they can do with it than you do. It also implies the right to engage in free and voluntary exchange or trade with other people. But I think it includes some other important pillars too, such as a spirit of enterprise, of entrepreneurship, of risk-taking, starting a business. And even then, I think foundational to all those principles is personal character. I don't think you can have a free market without a solid foundation of strong personal character. And that means things like honesty, putting truth on a pedestal and valuing it for its own sake, not just simply whenever it conveniences you. Also, personal responsibility, intellectual humility, recognizing that as much as you may know, there's still a universe of knowledge out there that you don't know, and things like patience and gratitude and courage. I'm one of those economists who doesn't talk just numbers, but also harkens back to the foundation of it all, which I think is strong personal character. I've never seen in all my studies a country in history that lost its character and kept its liberties. I don't think you can have freedom and free markets amongst the people who are dishonest, irresponsible, timid, impatient, just lousy, rotten people. So freedom goes hand in hand. Free markets go hand in hand with personal character.
I think of the opposite of a free market condition as a collectivist state where people might just not be as motivated to produce because they aren't incentivized to take that risk and innovate and produce.
Yes, and that's been the case throughout history. And Americans should know that because in the famous Plymouth settlement in Massachusetts with the Pilgrims, beginning in 1620, you had briefly, for about a couple of years, a kind of communalistic or communistic arrangement for society where everybody produced for the so-called common good, and it went into the common storehouse and was distributed equally to people. But it proved disastrous for all the reasons that it always does everywhere, because people started to realize, why should I work so hard? I get no more than the next guy. And let those other suckers do it, and I'll just sit back and relax and take my share. America has been fortunate because with those rare exceptions, like that brief experiment among the Pilgrims, we have practiced respect for the individual and his or her ability and willingness to strive, to create, to innovate, and to take risks. And that's really the engine of a prosperous free economy.
Now, you talk about what happened at Plymouth. You're looked at as an expert on the Great Depression. So let's bring it forward here to the 1920s. Talk about the Great Depression. Is it free market principles or was it excessive government intervention that helped lead to the Great Depression? And I think you stated in one of your books, in fact, and I think it's pretty easy to make the case that the Great Depression did result in more government intervention. So leading into the Great Depression, talk to us about the level of government intervention then.
There's no doubt in my mind, and I think this is an increasing conventional view among many economists who look back at that period, that the government was not an innocent bystander in the Great Depression, either its onset or its length and duration. During the 1920s, you had a couple decent presidents. Warren Harding, he's not often given a lot of credit, but he was better than a lot of people think. But even better was Calvin Coolidge, who practiced a kind of limited government perspective at home, reduced the national debt, reduced tax rates, and helped to produce the roaring 20s of economic growth. But at the same time that you had those good things happening, you had the seeds of the Great Depression being sown by the nation's monetary authorities, the Federal Reserve, which had been created just a few years before.
1913, yeah.
Yeah, that's right. From 1924 until early 1929, it was late in that year, of course, that the stock market fell apart and the whole Great Depression started. But from 24 to 29, the Federal Reserve was depressing interest rates by flooding the country with cheap money. It was expanding the money supply over that 5-year period by about 66%. The cheap money prompted a lot of borrowing, and for the moment, things looked great. But then beginning in 29, the Fed moved in the other direction. And over the next 3 or 4 years, it actually contracted the money supply by a third. That was what explains the start of the Great Depression. And then it was subsequent interventions by government that took really first a recession and made it a long Great Depression.
That sounds so familiar with printing a lot of money and having low borrowing costs and such. The Great Depression, that dragged on for such a long time, more than 10 years, from about 1929 to 1941 is where historians mark it. Why did it drag on so long? Could that ever happen again? I mean, do we have so much government intervention, which is really the opposite of free marketeerism? Do we have so much of that where we have sort of this mindset with the Fed and the powers that be that we don't want to allow a recession to happen? We don't even want to see the stock market dip. We're so ready to pump more dollars into this economy and suppress interest rates. Interest rates have been sinking for 40 years now. Are there any lessons from what happened in the Great Depression and why that dragged on for so long and how we can look at that today to avoid that?
I think a great analogy is to think of the guy who goes to a party and drinks like a fish. And he feels great. He's having a wonderful time. He goes home at 2 a.m. in the morning and plops into bed. But a few hours later, he wakes up with a horrific hangover. At that point, you could approach the problem, I suppose, 2 different ways. You could say to him, you obviously need another drink, so have another one, and you'll feel just as good as you did last night. That's what the monetary authorities do today. Before the patient gets too bad off, they just hand him another bottle, print more money. Or you could say to the patient, you actually did the harm that you're feeling now, but you did it last night. You're just paying the price for it now. So the best thing for you is to dry out and don't do that again. When you go back to the 1930s, you'll find some very interesting facts. As we mentioned, the stock market collapsed in late 1929. And a lot of people just sort of think, well, that was the start of the Depression and things must have been terrible right from that moment. But actually, by the spring of 1930, we didn't have a depression yet. It was only a recession. And the stock market had regained half of the ground it had lost. The unemployment rate in May of 1930 was only 8.5%. That's not a depression yet. But then in June of 1930, the president, Herbert Hoover at the time, signed into law the most damaging tariff schedule in American history, the Smoot-Hawley tariff. It virtually closed the borders. You have to remember that if you want to close the door to imports, you can only do that if you close the door to exports. And foreign governments retaliated. They said, if you're going to jack up tariffs on our stuff, we're going to do the same to you. And within weeks, the world economy ground to a halt. Any industry that was dependent significantly on the flow of international trade got hammered. That was a government intervention. That was not the free market. And then 2 years later, facing a massive government budget deficit, President Hoover signed into law a doubling of the income tax. Now think about that. At that point, unemployment was already in the vicinity of 20%. And he decides, well, we need more money into the government. So let's take a sick economy and double its tax burden, which was ridiculous and very harmful. He got thrown out of office. Franklin Roosevelt came in his place. He proceeded over the next 7 years or so to impose all kinds of other costly interventions that kept us in depression.
Higher taxes and the introduction of tariffs, basically the opposite of laissez-faire, the opposite of free market capitalism. How does this, though, leading back to my earlier question about it disadvantaging the poor, does free markets and those principles, does that spread the wealth uniformly enough, or are the poor disadvantaged?
A free market is the best friend of the poor. What's the alternative? A government-controlled, government-managed market? In those instances, the poor who don't have the financial wherewithal to buy themselves a politician, they're at an automatic disadvantage. The people who are well-connected, who are already wealthy, they get in bed with the politicians and they make sure that they're taken care of. Doors to economic opportunity are closed to those on the lowest rungs of the economic ladder. If you want prosperity for the poor, you want to give them opportunities to start businesses, to be mobile and go from here to there, wherever the jobs are. You want to have a good education system so they can learn what they need to know to progress and succeed in life. And all of that comes from freedom and competition and accountability and private enterprise, not from politicians.
You got to incentivize people to want to learn and better themselves and educate themselves and practice skills and innovate and pull themselves up. That's what free market capitalism can often do. It has been 90 plus years since the Great Depression. I think you could probably point to a number of places where we have more government intervention now than we had then. We have a more managed economy than we had then. So why don't we take what we learned from the Great Depression and all the subsequent government intervention and talk about where we are going to go next? I know that's a really giant question. We look at where the economy might be headed next, how the government's going to respond, how they don't appear to want to let a recession happen. Today, Larry, we have what some people characterize as a fairly thriving economy. When you look at things like the GDP is up, and now unemployment is below 4%. Yes, it's measured differently than it was back about 90 years ago. But there are also a number of problems in today's economy. CPI inflation is soaring. Can you really call it a good economy when you have shortages of all these items and more commodity shortages potentially coming from Russia invading Ukraine? So talk to us about some of the lessons from the past and how we can use those to build a better future.
As a historian, I've always been interested in getting people to appreciate the lessons from the past, from the Great Depression. And I wish we could get them to understand and appreciate the lessons just from the last big recession we've had in 2008, 2009.
Right.
Think back to what preceded that. You had several years of easy money, the Federal Reserve cranking the stuff out, keeping interest rates low, jawboning banks to make loans to people for new homes. that they ultimately couldn't afford. You had a bubble created by Federal Reserve policy. Then when it burst, we paid the price of a painful recession. You'd think that people would say, we should learn from that. Let's not do that again. Let's not pump up the economy artificially with cheap money and low interest rates. And yet that's precisely what the Fed has been doing for years. And it's why I fear that we're creating yet another bubble. You're seeing some of the effects of that with the soaring real estate prices until the last few days, even a very robust stock market. Interest rates have been kept artificially low now for so many years. What that ends up doing is simply putting off a day of reckoning and making it ultimately more painful and perhaps longer than it needs to be. Again, it's like that analogy I gave you of going to the drunk and say, here's another bottle. Yeah, he's off to the ceiling again, but he's not going to get any better. In fact, he's just setting himself up for another hangover. And I fear that's what we're doing today. If you're poor, you should be especially afraid because, again, the rich will find ways in most cases to manage and to get by, no matter what the circumstances are. But if you're poor, you're the last person on the mind of the government when it's created a depression to pay for its previous inflation.
Former president of the Foundation for Economic Education, Larry Reed, and I have quite a bit more to discuss with today's economy and its future direction. And what is the free market like in real estate today? You're listening to Get Rich Education. I'm your host, Keith Weinhold. You know, a lot of investors choose either cash flow or home price appreciation, but one real estate market could provide both: Jacksonville, Florida. They've got 27% lower home prices and higher rents than the national median. Their market has appreciated 34% more than other comparable cash flow markets over the last 30 years. Get positive cash flow today and above average appreciation for tomorrow. They often have available inventory in Jacksonville, if you can believe that. Start at cashflowandgrowth.com. You can get a 50-year-old house somewhere or buy a new one directly from the builder with tenant resilient amenities already built in. With over 3,000 Florida units at different construction stages, they are exclusively for investors. President Wagner and Alaska and team also invest strongly in their own product. That's belief. Start at buildtorentdirect.com. That's build the number 2 rentdirect.com or text 407-927-5074.
This is the EQRP Company's Damian Lupo. The scarcity mentality is abundant, and the abundance mentality is scarce. Listen to Get Rich Education with Keith Weinhold.
Trying to forget you. I'm all alone in a ghost town. There's a beautiful madness inside my soul, and I can't stop thinking of you.
Welcome back to Get Rich Education. We're talking with best-selling editor of some very popular economics books and the longtime and former president of FEE, the Foundation for Economic Education. You can learn more about them at fee.org. Larry, we've been talking about today's economy and the level of government intervention in it. And yeah, there are some parallels with the last recession. The government began these quantitative easing cycles, pumping extra money into the economy. And that was unprecedented. And now really the question seems to be more often, well, what's the right level of QE? Not are we going to have QE, which was seen as an emergency measure just 15 years ago. With what's going on with housing and the real estate market, we're obviously very interested in that. So many dollars have been printed. Mortgage interest rates continue to go lower and lower and lower. I think there are a number of differences between today's housing market and the one from 15 years ago. For example, mortgage underwriting standards are substantially better, and the supply of housing is just incredibly low, where we were oversupplied 15 years ago. But one parallel is with all this money printing taking place today, though that looks to unwind. I just wonder if they can unwind it and really how that correlates with how all of this money printing really got juiced again starting about 15 years ago. So what are your thoughts with that in the future of the economy?
Well, real estate, Keith, has always been very interest rate sensitive because so many real estate purchases have to be financed at an interest rate. And so if you go from 2 or 3% on interest rates to 5 or 6 or 9 or 10, that makes a massive difference in the real estate market. And now the Fed, after having been so accommodative, so expansionist, printing money like crazy, 30% increase in the last 2 years in the basic money supply, that's almost unprecedented in the post-war period. It's been creating a bubble. And now with price inflation kicking up, The question is, well, how fast is the Fed going to try to counter that by raising interest rates? And it has signaled that it's going to start that this month. I'm guessing that price inflation, which is already much higher than they ever expected, will yet go higher than they ever expected. And the Fed, once again, will be caught behind the eight ball. And the result will be a more rapid hike in interest rates and probably to higher levels than anybody right now is foreseeing. When that happens, the real estate bubble is over. Likely economic recession will take place. You've also got the problem of government debt. The national debt just went through $30 trillion, rising fast. The annual deficit in the federal government's budget is in excess of $1 trillion. And that represents a massive sopping up of capital that could otherwise go to the creating new businesses or expanding existing ones. So the government's doing an awful lot of harm. And much of its money printing is simply a way to cover or mask the harm that it's doing. If they weren't creating the massive volume of money that they were, but still running the deficits that they are, interest rates would go through the roof because you'd have, another $1 trillion sucked out of the capital market just to pay the government's current bills. And with no Fed to accommodate by printing money, we'd all be paying far higher interest rates right now.
That's right. So the Fed has suppressed interest rates, and that's basically been really good for real estate investors. In fact, real estate investors are benefiting substantially right now because we sort of have this inversion where stated CPI inflation is about double what interest rates are. I just don't know how long that's sustainable with what we need to do to keep the economy vibrant.
One of the eternal problems in economics, and especially public policy, is the failure to consider the long run, to think of only the short run and ignore the long run consequences of what one is doing. If I could go back, let's say, to ancient Rome, I always use this example because it's a good way to illustrate the point. We know historically that ancient Rome lost its republic and ultimately, after the period of the empire, lost its life, mainly because of the growth of government in both its overseas foreign military spending and its welfare state at home. All these things started out with lots of popular support. If I could go back to ancient Rome, let's say in the 1st century BC, and I had a big audience of Romans I could talk to, I would like to say to them, you folks have recently bought into this idea that the government can give you all kinds of free stuff, and you're going down that path lickety-split. And for the moment, it feels pretty good, doesn't it? But let me tell you, because I come from the future, I can tell you where this is all going to lead. It's going to snowball until someday the government will be taking so much of your wealth to give you a portion of it back, you're not going to be able to afford it. And it will print or not print. In those days, it had to coin cheaper money before paper money. It's going to cheapen your currency, and you folks are going to lose everything. Now, do you still want to go down that path? My guess is a lot of Romans will say, hey, in the long run, we're all dead anyway. So just like John Maynard Keynes, the British economist, once said, so let's do it now, and some future generation will pick up the tab or figure it out. That's the age-old problem in economics, doing what strikes the eye, keeps people happy for the moment, come hell or high water, and forgetting that someday the piper must be paid.
Yes, wanting to get reelected for the next election cycle and not thinking too far beyond that is a substantial part of the mindset there, surely. And you liken things to the Romans, and, it really makes one wonder, do many civilizations end due to too much government intervention? Look around the United States now. I think one can say that the government has intervened in setting interest rate policy with the Federal Reserve, and you can definitely have a conversation about how federal they really are, but with the Federal Reserve setting interest rate policy even, maybe the free market would do a better job of that. So wrapping up here, there's some other places where it would be better if the free market were allowed to take its course rather than there being government intervention, even in something like interest rate policy.
Oh, yes. I think almost invariably free markets will do a better job than government. I'm not an anarchist, so there are things like national defense, a court system, the police that I think a government has to run. But even then, it doesn't mean that the government has to do it without any competition. Can you imagine if the government said, well, national defense is so important that we're going to have our own government tank factories and government-owned plane factories, and Well, the Soviet Union did that, and they made lousy tanks and lousy planes. Whereas in the US, we say, yeah, the government will pay for them, but we're going to hire competitive, private, innovative contractors to actually produce the stuff. So even in important things, you can have a large role for the private sector. But in the long run, government is no smarter, it's no more compassionate, it's no more forward thinking than the people at large. You can't expect the government to be of solid character if its people are not. It's at best, it's a reflection of the character of its people, but usually it's worse than that because of all the incentives inherent within government to think of only the short run, buy votes with other people's money. That's why our founding fathers said, hey, yeah, we got to have one, but let's keep it small and responsible and accountable. And even then, you have to have, as Ben Franklin said, eternal vigilance.
Now, what are some actionable things that people can really do to promote free market principles?
It starts, I think, in the home. Don't send your children to school thinking that the teachers will tell them these important things, because they might and they might not. It's important for parents to start at home to teach young people things like respect for property, respect for private contracts, entrepreneurship, risk-taking within a prudent framework, and so forth. Being independent and self-reliant and productive, adding new wealth to society, not sitting back simply and saying, hey, I'm entitled, give me a portion of what other people have learned. Those ethics of freedom and free markets really have to start in the home. And then you have to constantly reinforce them, because these days, especially in the public school system, these are not values that are commonly taught. And students end up graduating from high school thinking that free enterprise is bad, government is good, it helps people, and so forth. And free enterprise is greedy, and all those myths that we end up spending so much time having to undo later. So it starts in the home. Educate and hold your children's teachers accountable to what you know to be the truth.
These are great actionable tips. I think a lot of it comes down to a phrase I love, and that is self-reliance. Because if you're not self-reliant, and the less self-reliant you are, as you go through life, the more reliant on others, and oftentimes that ends up relying on the government. And we know how too much of that can surely end up. Where can one learn more about you? You've done a lot of work with the Foundation for Economic Education and helping champion some of these principles. Let our audience know where they can learn more.
Certainly at fee.org, the foundation's website, people can see a lot of my stuff and lots of other people's material. At that site, Fee also offers free online courses and videos and news of upcoming events, daily fresh commentary 7 days a week. If you're interested in my material in particular, whether it appears at Fee or other places, I put everything I write on my website, which is lawrencewreed.com, LAWRENCE, middle initial W, last name Reed, no punctuation, lawrencewreed.com.
Larry Reed, it's been really thought-provoking. Thanks so much for coming on the show.
My pleasure. Thank you, Keith.
Now, as you've kept up with world events over time, you might just ask yourself this question. Have you ever seen refugees try to flee a nation and scale razor wire fence to escape the evils of free market capitalism or to escape the evils of government repression? Which one? It's probably the latter. But yeah, it comes back to being a principled person, like Larry Reed said, and becoming self-reliant, a term that I introduced there. When it comes to you building your financial freedom through real estate, that is really an outward expression of you being a self-reliant individual, because you're saying that you're not going to be reliant on just one employer for your principal source of income. So just ask yourself, what if your income from your day job went away? Where would that leave you if that day job income were gone? Could you survive for 1 week or 1 month or 10 years? Or have you worked your way up to financial self-reliance, where you have multiple streams of income? And within real estate, I have often suggested that you be invested in multiple geographic markets, and now you're not even vulnerable to the shifts in one market, whether that be an economic contraction or a policy change in that metro area or something else. And that's really why I put together the ultimate resource for you, at gremarketplace.com, connecting you with income property providers in multiple markets, including ones that I invest in myself. The income streams are durable. Another way to look at that is resilient, because housing is a basic human need, and that's not going to change anytime soon. So log in and connect with providers at gremarketplace.com. When it comes down to the conflict between free market principles and government intervention, be self-reliant. It is going to make you resilient. Big thanks for the brilliant insight of Larry Reed today. Learn more at fee.org. Until next week, I'm your host, Keith Weinhold. Don't quit your daydream.
Nothing on this show should be considered specific, personal, or professional advice. Please consult an appropriate tax, legal, real estate, financial, or business professional for individualized advice. Opinions of guests are their own. Information is not guaranteed. All investment strategies have the potential for profit or loss. The host is operating on behalf of Get Rich Education, LLC exclusively.
The preceding program was brought to you by your home for wealth building, GetRichEducation.com.